Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on Sydney. Not just the postcard city, the opera house, the harbor bridge, but the raw, sometimes surprising history simmering underneath.
Indeed. And what's really striking when you look at the sources is how often that sort of shimmering surface has masked things, not just history, but sometimes active suppression of certain stories. So yeah, our deep dive today is about peeling back those layers, moving past those icons to really get the journey.
From that challenging convict settlement?
To the vibrant global metropolis you see today.
Exactly. Our mission really is to sift through all this material, academic papers, historical bits, expert research, quite a stack of sources, actually. And we want to uncover the key turning points, maybe some unexpected facts, and the legacies, the things that have shaped this unique place. So, yeah, get ready to maybe rethink what you know about Sydney.
Okay, let's unpack this right from the start then. Before any British flag went up, this land was just teeming with life, with culture. You might think Sydney's history kicks off, say, 1788. But the sources make it incredibly clear. The real starting point, the roots of the Australian population, stretch back maybe 50,000 years, long before any European contact.
Yeah, what's fascinating there is the sheer depth of that Indigenous history, particularly the Eora Nation. That's the group associated with the Sydney area. The sources really highlight how their cultural histories, covering coastal people, river people, it shows this continuous occupation. It predates and postdates European arrival.
Wow, 50,000 years. And the Eora Nation, it wasn't just one group. It comprised at least 7 distinct clans. You've got the Gadigal, the Baroa, each with its own dialect, recognized territories. And these weren't nomadic people wandering around. No, they were sedentary. They had access to huge food supplies from the estuaries, the harbors. Yeah, very settled.
Right. And it sounds like a highly organized society, too. The sources talk about clan areas being patrilineal.
That's right, yeah. Land, resources inherited from the father's side.
Okay.
And their daily life, it was structured. Small groups, bands, they're called, maybe 25, 30 people. And quite clear gender roles describe males hunting, females gathering. Pretty standard for many societies, but well-defined.
And they had calendars based on seasons.
Absolutely. Tied directly to the seasonal availability of staple foods, they followed a very specific seasonal round itinerary. It wasn't random. And kinship was fundamental. It formed the basis of larger groupings. It regulated marriage, strict rules about not marrying your own kin.
Yeah.
But here's something from the sources that's, well, really profound. It kind of reframes things. These Aboriginal coexistence tactics developed over 50,000 years of survival, often in hostile conditions.
Coexistence tactics? Like what?
Well, the sources list things like foot dragging, playing dumb, pretending to agree on plans not intended to be executed.
Playing dumb, pretending to agree.
Yeah. Isolation, tactics designed not to be fooled, and many in varied forms of humor.
Humor as a tactic. That's unexpected. Foot dragging, playing dumb.
Yeah.
Makes you think, doesn't it? These aren't passive things at all. They're strategies. Refined over millennia, shows incredible depth.
It absolutely does. The sources stress these weren't just, random responses. It was a complex system. Resistance, survival, developed long before Europeans, and then adapted for interacting with them.
Right.
Imagine a culture where, humor could be a shield, or where pretending to agree was a way to avoid direct conflict with a force that was, frankly, overwhelming. It really forces us to rethink what resistance even looks like, challenges that old narrative of just passive victims.
Yeah, that's a really powerful lens. And it brings us straight to that next chapter, first contact. Imagine being Eora, sophisticated, deeply connected to your land, and suddenly seeing a huge ship entering your bay for the very first time. The sources, they paint this picture of initial, surprise, amazement, wonder, and enthusiasm tempered by curiosity.
Which leads to the crucial question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How did that initial cautious excitement turn into conflict, such devastating conflict? The sources are pretty clear. The British navigators Cook in 1770, Philip in 1788, they operated under this belief, this assumption that the land was unoccupied, terra nullius.
Despite thousands of people living there.
Despite, over 2,000 Aboriginal people clearly present around Sydney Harbor alone. And that flawed belief led directly to Cook claiming the whole eastern part of the continent for England.
And Cook, he didn't even nail the landing first time, did he? The sources say he sailed right past Sydney Harbor's entrance on that first voyage in 1770, called it a huge, forbidding entrance.
Yeah, dismissed it. Favored what he called Botany Bay instead. His descriptions are brief snow-white cliffs, elegant trees, but also a vasty bog.
A vasty bog. It's almost comical comparing his quick look to the rich ecosystem the Eora knew intimately.
It really highlights the mindset, though. Sir Joseph Banks, the botanist traveling with Cook, he described Botany Bay as barren, with very coarse, thick bushes and ghastly, crooked, great spreading trees, even though he also saw colorful birds flying as girls. The sources kind of paint him as a world builder, someone who wanted a blank slate.
Like English rubble was better for building on.
Exactly. He preferred that idea over recognizing the established, rich environment that was already there. And that mindset, that was pretty foundational to the conflict that came next.
So these early kind of dismissive British views paved the way for the First Fleet. 11 ships, let's see, the sources say 576 male convicts, 192 female convicts, plus military, some free settlers, left Portsmouth May 1787.
Arrived at Botany Bay January 18th, 1788, and immediately found it unsuitable, just as Banks had sort of implied, ironically.
So they didn't stay.
No. They quickly transferred up to Sydney Cove, landed there January 26, 1788, the day now celebrated, of course, as Australia Day.
Okay. And initially, how did the Eora react to this actual settlement?
Well, initially, the sources say the Eora were good friends. They even shared food with the Europeans who were starving.
Really? Shared food?
Yeah, points to maybe a period of tentative interaction. Maybe those coexistence tactics were in play, trying to manage the situation.
But it didn't last.
No. As European numbers grew and their needs for land, for resources just exploded, conflict became, as the sources stated, inevitable.
It feels so tragic. And the sources, they list the European weapons. It wasn't just guns.
No. Muskets, swords, knives, yes, but also smallpox. Devastating. They specifically mentioned the capture of an Aboriginal man, Arabanu. He was taken and then died of smallpox. It really underscores the lethal impact of these new diseases.
Just devastating.
Absolutely. The expansion of British settlement, it just had a devastating effect on local indigenous people, leading to, and this is a direct quote, the destruction of an established Aboriginal population ignored in most official writings.
Ignored in official writings. That says a lot.
It does. It's a very sobering reminder that Sydney's foundation rests on this incredibly disruptive, violent encounter.
So, having set that scene, that initial clash, let's focus on the early colony itself. The sheer struggle. It was far from the grand city we see now. The sources paint a really bleak picture, a penal colony fighting the land itself.
Yeah, and this context really shows how much the natural conditions shaped everything. Governor Phillip's own letters back home. February 1788, he describes Sydney Cove. Beautiful harbor, yes, but relentlessly unfriendly. Rocky, barren suburbs, few resources. Even the water from the tank stream was brackish.
Unfriendly.
And while the idea was maybe farming wheat orchards for years, its main function was just being a prison, a penal colony. That overshadowed everything.
And the food shortages? The sources mention them being acute.
Oh, absolutely desperate. By 1791, Philip's struggling to grow wheat, seeds rotting in the ground, unfit earth. Rations get halved in 1793. Too few producing, the records say. They resorted to eating blubber whale.
Whale blubber.
Yeah. People became crabbers. They licensed fish drying houses, just trying to preserve anything they could catch. Constant grinding hunger.
It sounds horrific.
The sources use phrases like an Australian Robben's Island, or even starker. A living memorial to England's shameful poverty.
A memorial to poverty.
Yeah, it suggests Sydney was almost designed to embody England's social problems, shipped overseas. Convicts had to be sent out, exploring valleys, just to find basic stuff, like moss to patch bark-hut roofs. It was hand-to-mouth.
Incredible. Even basic institutions struggled, right? Like the Sydney School.
Oh, yeah. Established 1848, but its existence was nomadic for ages. Started in a church, moved to a courthouse, then barracks, a hospital, a stable, a lockup, even a jail.
A jail. A school and a jail.
Yep, before they even considered a permanent building. Shows how slow and tough establishing anything was.
Just finding a place to put things.
Yet, somehow, amidst all that hardship, St. Mary's Cathedral gets built, on the highest point, using local Castleton sandstone finished around 1853. A symbol of trying, maybe?
Yeah, a sign of trying to build something permanent, even then. Okay, so amidst the struggle, a city is very slowly, painfully starting to form. Let's explore how Sydney begins to shed those prison chains, forge a new identity, migration, gold. Things start changing.
Right, and this makes you think about how those early economic factors, social factors, they all kind of weave together to shape the city's character, don't they? By 1842, Sydney's proclaimed a city, that's a big step, signals independence from direct British control. And the growth, considering the start, is astonishing. The sources say from just 30 houses in 1788 to a city of stone and brick with the grandest buildings and wharf in the southern hemisphere within, well, just over 50 years, but still impressive. 9 years mentioned somewhere, perhaps referring to a specific later boom.
Grandest wharf in the southern hemisphere. Quite a claim. But getting around must have been tough. Transport.
Oh, primitive. No proper roads for the first 2 years. A real shortage of draft animals, horses, oxen. So convicts did the work. Dragging loads, hauling stone, as the sources put it.
Wow. Human labor.
Yeah. And the first public transport, a tiny ferry boat from the cove over to the rocks area, 6 cents a head.
6 pence. That feels very old-timey.
Doesn't it? And the population mix starts changing too, initially seen as very English because most convicts were English. But that apparent dominance, as the sources call it, narrows considerably in the 1840s. Big surge of Irish immigration.
Okay, so more diversity coming in?
Definitely. But the real seismic shift, the 1850s, gold, discovered in New South Wales.
Yeah.
And that just transformed Sydney into a vital port for millions of diggers, people flooding in.
Millions. Wow. How much did the population jump?
Sources say it at least doubled, from around 40,000 in 1851 to roughly 80,000 by 1854, in just 3 years.
Doubled in 3 years. That must have been chaotic. Opportunity, but chaos?
Absolutely. Brought enormous fortunes or massive debts. A real boom and bust feel. Now, that mass immigration, it was actually short-lived. There was a big depression in 1856 that slowed things down, but it fundamentally changed the city, the demographics, the economy, everything.
Right. Set it on a new path. But it wasn't the only big player, was it? Melbourne comes into the picture?
Exactly. Earlier on, Governor King had called Sydney's harbor one of the finest ports in the universe. High praise. But by the end of the 1850s, Melbourne had surged ahead, seen as the greater city, had a university, fancy homes, more culture and opulence.
Ah, the Sydney-Melbourne rivalry begins.
Pretty much. And that rivalry, that dynamic, plays a big part in what comes next, building a nation.
Right. The 19th century really does set the stage for this huge change, creating Australia as a nation. And you might not realize just how central Sydney was to that whole ambitious project federation.
Stepping back, you see the push for federation came from shared problems, right? Trade issues between colonies, defense concerns, immigration policies.
Things they needed to tackle together.
Exactly. And Sir Henry Parkes, often called the father of federation, he kicked the whole thing off with a conference where Sydney, 1890. So Sydney's really the birthplace of that national idea in a formal sense.
Okay, so the first step was taken in Sydney, and the momentum built from there.
It did. A successful convention met again in Sydney in 1897, produced a draft constitution, which was then put to referenda in the 6 colonies and eventually approved.
And then the big day, January 1st, 1901.
Commonwealth of Australia formed, marked by elaborate celebrations and extensive parades right there in Sydney.
Must have been quite a sight.
Although the sources add a little grit to the picture. They mention riots in the slums below the Domain stole much of the occasion's glory.
Riots during the Federation celebrations.
Apparently so. A fascinating detail, isn't it? Shows that even in moments of national unity, those underlying social tensions were still there.
Yeah, definitely adds a layer. And Sydney was the capital then, briefly.
Only for the first few years. The Commonwealth Parliament met there initially, but the location of the permanent capital was a huge argument, resolved by the Seat of Government Act in 1908. Canberra was chosen.
Why Canberra?
Well, the idea was a new city, deliberately on the land of no one, a bush capital, an Australian Athens, some hoped, meant to be free of those old rivalries, the class conflicts they saw in Sydney and Melbourne.
A fresh start.
Supposedly. Though the sources note that the fight over Canberra and against its further development persisted throughout the 20th century.
Yeah.
So it wasn't exactly smooth sailing.
Right. And speaking of shaping the new nation, there was a major policy decision around that time, too.
Yes. The White Australia policy was articulated only in 1901, aimed for a universal exclusion of non-Europeans, with New Zealand as a notable exception.
The sources are quite direct about it.
They are. Land was promised to white arrivals but denied to blacks and non-whites. It was a policy that profoundly shaped Australia's identity, its demographics, its global image for decades.
Okay, so Federation happens, the capital moves. Then the 20th century throws some massive challenges Sydney's way. Depression, wars.
Yeah, the early 20th century really tested the city's resilience. What's striking is Sydney entered the 1930s apparently in good spirits, coming off some triumphs in the 1920s. But then the Great Depression hit. The New York stock market crash, October 1929. It wasn't just Wall Street. It hit this continent hard. Banks refused to advance loans.
And the human cost.
Immense. Unemployment reached wartime proportions. Sources quote a 40% unemployment rate in Sydney in 1932.
40%. Unbelievable.
People from every walk of life were thrown into hopeless poverty. Charitable agencies just completely overburdened. It really shows how connected the world economy was even then.
And then the wars. Global conflicts arriving on Sydney's shores.
World War I, Australia joined pretty much immediately. Troops left from Sydney. And there's an interesting side note in the sources. A shipyard in Petersham, a suburb of Sydney, actually built an ocean liner for America during the war.
Really? Building ships for the U.S.?
Yeah, highlights Sydney's industrial capacity even then. The sources describe the city at this time as life-size, made for distributing life, even while caught up in global conflict.
But World War II brought the threat much closer, didn't it?
Oh, completely shattered any sense of isolation. After England's defeat in Europe in 1940, the sources say, turmoil arrived on Australian shores. Suddenly, there was an urgent need for coastal towns of Sydney be fortified.
Because of the Japanese threat.
Exactly. The Japanese strike towards Australia from the north progressed relentlessly and ruthlessly, including the bombing of Darwin up north, and then the infamous air raid upon Sydney Cove itself by midget submarines, May 1942.
Right into the harbor.
Right into the heart of the city. That forced Prime Minister John Curtin to make that huge historic decision, seek military help directly from the United States.
Shifting away from Britain.
A major strategic shift.
Yeah.
The first American warships arrived in Sydney Harbor, December 1941.
So a new alliance formed under pressure. But the danger wasn't over.
No. Even German U-boats were active. U-862 carried out reconnaissance, torpedoed tankers, right in or near Sydney Harbor. December 1943.
German U-boats too, wow.
Yeah. Sydney truly became a garrison city, a frontline city in a global war.
Okay, fast forward, post-war era. This is where Sydney really starts to morph into the modern global city we recognize, isn't it? A story of ambition, huge growth, but also clashes over what the city should even look like.
Yeah, the bigger picture here is clear. Post-World War II saw the largest population increase and most extensive development ever in Sydney's history. It was transformative. The skyline itself was irreversibly altered. 1959, Sydney gets its first proper skyscraper. The AMP building, 18 levels. It dominated the skyline of a moribund CBD.
Moribund. So the city center was pretty quiet before that.
Apparently so, yeah. And think about the scale of expansion. Population was only 10,000 back in 1835. Post-WWII, suburbs just sprawl outwards for hundreds of kilometers from the coast.
What fueled that boom?
Policy played a big part. A pro-business government in the 1960s swept aside heavy regulation and restrictive development controls. Basically opened the floodgates for building.
And infrastructure had to keep up, presumably.
Big time. Major transport projects get built. New tollways, the Spit Bridge connecting the northern beaches, Sydney Airport upgrades. The Eastern Suburbs Railway, though that took ages, finally opened in 1979. Huge construction push.
But all that rapid growth, it must have caused problems too. Friction.
Definitely. It created, as the sources say, a problem of local government's administration, just managing it all. And it sparked intense public interest in town planning. People started asking questions about the direction of development. There was a notable period of discontent, 1970-71, specifically over development, planning authorities, people pushing back.
So growing pains, big ones.
Huge growing pains. But despite those, by the end of the war, Sydney had clearly emerged as number one. Australia's largest city, the political capital, and the commercial and financial center. And since then, it's really solidified its place as a mature global city. International economic clout, cultural influence, administrative power.
When you see that in its international role today, right? Diplomatic missions.
Absolutely. Home to Australia's most important diplomatic missions, 10 high commissions, 50 consulates. Huge diplomatic presence. Plus, its growing prominence as a destination for learning. Universities attracting international students, leading to a ballooning expatriate community.
So very connected globally.
Yeah, the sources talk about its unarguable global status and a deliberate effort to strengthen its image as a gateway to Asia-Pacific.
Okay, so beyond the buildings, the economy, what about Sydney's culture?
Yeah.
Its identity that's constantly evolving too. And looking forward, there seems to be this real push for sustainability.
Yeah, on the cultural side, there's a fascinating insight in the sources about how Sydney's white children reinterpreted the world from their own perspectives.
Yeah.
Evolving unique play lore that became a part of the popular culture of Sydney.
Playlore. Like kids' games and rhymes?
Exactly. Blending European traditions with the local environment, the local context, creating something new, something distinctly Sydney. It reflects that broader cultural evolution, that adaptation.
That's really interesting. And the formal arts scene today, it's huge.
Oh, world class. A thriving arts sector. You've
Yeah.
got the icons, obviously Opera House, Harbor Bridge, but they're hubs of activity. Major annual events, Sydney Festival, the Biennale, Vivid Sydney Lighting Festival.
Vivid's amazing.
Yeah. Plus countless galleries,
Mhm.
museums. The Powerhouse is Australia's largest museum, outdoor sculptures everywhere, a really vibrant music scene, top-tier orchestras. Culture is central.
And multiculturalism is key to that identity now, too, isn't it?
Hugely important. Sydney is home to the largest immigrant population of any city in Australia. Now remember that white Australia policy from 1901 aimed at restriction.
Right.
Well, post-World War II, things changed. Big waves of immigration, especially non-European ethnic groups, massively increased diversity,
Yeah.
leading to the emergence and growth of ethnic enclaves, suburbs, and gardens. It fundamentally reshaped the city's social fabric, created the multicultural hub it is today.
Okay, and looking to the future now, sustainability seems to be the big focus.
Very much so. Post-2000, a continued emphasis on sustainability. The City of Sydney Council adopted a Sustainable Sydney Strategic Plan. Really ambitious goals.
Like what?
Things like leading the way to sustainability, pushing for public transport for the 21st century, designing a green city, a sustainable urban forest.
A sustainable urban forest. Cool.
Yeah. And concrete targets, too. An energy action plan aimed for 10% energy consumption reduction, 20% emissions reduction by 2012. And looking further ahead, a 2050 walkable city vision, aiming for zero net long-term GHG emissions. Real commitment, on paper at least, to a greener future.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a huge amount of ground. From that harsh, struggling convict outpost to this dynamic, complex, global city. We've seen its fortunes tied to gold rushes, its central role in birthing a nation, and how it faced down incredible challenges: famine, depression, world wars.
It really is a history defined by adaptation, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Resilience, this constant reshaping of identity. From a place that was meant to be English, fundamentally, to this incredibly vibrant multicultural center right at the heart of the Asia-Pacific. It's quite a transformation.
It really is. And the sources leave us with this interesting thought, this sense of a burnt city waiting for a new renaissance, emphasizing a need for sane discourse and objective exploration in planning its future. So here's something for you, the listener, to think about. Given Sydney's incredible growth, all those planning challenges we talked about throughout its history, what do you think is the biggest hurdle now, the biggest challenge for Sydney to truly become that friendly city it aspires to be, while still holding on to its unique mix of ambition and that stunning natural beauty? Something to ponder.